So we have a basket club, and occasionally we replace our basket club with other classes on how to make crafts out of native plants or about native plants. So we're going to have some people who do botanical drawings come and show stuff. This year we're going to have a lot of basket clubs. We already had a cordage making club. Does anybody know what cordage is? It's thread, rope, string. Those are just different sizes of the same thing. And there's a lot of different ways to make it, and there's a lot of things that you can make it from, and it's useful for everything. So the first thing that I want to kind of point out is that this is made from yucca. Does everybody know what yucca is? Okay, it is kind of pointy, it grows about like yay high, and it's native to here. And the cool thing about yucca is that is what indigenous peoples in this area made a lot of their clothes out of prior to colonization. And there's several reasons for that. One is that it just renders into fiber pretty easily. But another one is that it's pretty antimicrobial. You actually can use other yuccas to make soap. The native ones you can make soap with, but it's a little bit more difficult than the ones that you would have maybe out west. And then the other reason is just that it's incredibly, incredibly soft. But when you think about like how many layers of clothing we are all wearing today, that is a lot of this. And that's a lot of this that is made incredibly well. This is really nicely made cordage. So is this. But even they are not thin enough to really weave into clothing like you think about. People historically spent as much time or more time making the stuff for their clothes and making their clothes than they did actually farming, hunting, or gathering. We think about our past a very specific way. We think about what our ancestors did in very, very narrow terms. We think everybody way back was hunting mammoths, but in reality, that was something that very few people did. And that's something that the people who did it spent very little time on. All hunter-gatherer societies, all indigenous societies, all societies in human history spent a lot of time making cordage, making clothes. Whenever you think about your food storage historically, where are you going to put it? You're going to put it in your pottery, you're going to put it in your baskets, and you're going to put it in bags. Historically, a lot of indigenous people in this area would make bags out of yucca, and then they would carry them around on their forehead, and they would use that to pull their firewood, and also to pull like lots of different things that they harvested. It's called a tump line. And whenever you would have the Choctaw and the Creek people in this area, they would have not just their homes, they would also have a storage home. So basically a second house that's just a pantry. And that's something that we see all across the world. And that storage home would be filled with a bunch of bags made out of yucca fiber that were full of different things that they wanted to save for the rest of the year. And so if you want to ever think about how you would have spent your time, 1,000 years ago in this area, sit down and make some string all day. And that would be a lot of it. And I will tell you, you will appreciate everything you own way more. I know I got a big walk-in closet full of clothes, but honestly, this dress right here would take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours just to make the string for it historically. And in other places in the world, we would have stuff like the spinning wheel using animal fibers, but here, that is not a thing that people had access to or used. So we're gonna take a second, and Klahzia is going to show y'all a little bit about the basics to make rope, string, and thread out of native plants. But did you want to start with... So we're going to start with already made fibers, mostly just because they're larger and you can actually see them from over there. And Klahzia's going to demonstrate some of the techniques. So what Klahzia's doing is beginning with a twist, and just twisting it and twisting it and twisting it. And if you ever twisted anything, eventually it'll fold over on itself, right? You twist something enough, and it wants to collapse. And then you get this little loop, like Klahzia has there. And then, in order to keep this from unwinding itself, you twist away, and then you twist around. So would you maybe kind of do that a little higher up so that people can see it? So you twist away, and then you twist around, you tuck it under. And there's a lot of different techniques people use whenever they're making this, and it turns out just the same. Some people do it against their thigh. My hands don't work very well, so I have to use my teeth, which, you gotta be good at plant ID if you're doing that, because you don't want to get poisoned. Yeah, and so if you look, what Klahzia's doing is just slowly passing it down in their fingers to keep tension. Now you can also tie the end off or hold it in your teeth, or some people tie it to their big toe. And then if you do it that way, you keep that tension pretty well, and that can also help you control the strength and density. You can make rope really fast if you're making it pretty weak by doing basically like longer gaps between the twists. But this really tight twisting that Klahzia's doing will make a much, much stronger rope. And different fibers are going to last for different periods of time. So we have some corn husk rope up here. This is not necessarily the best rope, it's not the strongest rope, but it is abundant. You have lots of corn husk if you're an agricultural person living in this area prior to colonization, right? And so this is something you're gonna make a lot of just because it's easy. So this is what Klahzia managed to make in just about a minute, right? Klahzia's pretty good at this, faster than most people. But if you did this every day, you could make a lot of this pretty fast. But even then, try to imagine making enough threads for your sheets out of that, right? It's ridiculous. It's a lot, but that's what people did. Do you want to transition to the plant fiber? Or?
Macrame is mostly just the tying knots of cordage. So yeah, it would be like the makings of macrame. Okay. Or the supplies?
Yeah, you're making the supplies for it. So this is the yucca fiber, or this is the yucca plant leaf. It's a little bit sharp on the sides. They're pointy. But if you look here, it has this basically it has a bunch of little tubes that it uses to transport and store water and other nutrients across the plant, right? And those little tubes render into fiber pretty easily. This is the fiber that they render to. And you can see it's about that long, and it's about that long because the leaf is about that long. Whenever you're making cordage, you might think, well, I could only get about this far before I would have to tie it off. But every rope that you've ever seen isn't just tied off every few inches. And that is because you can slowly add in more strands and more fibers. You really, whenever you're making your initial twist, you want to have about 60-40 on each side, and that's the length of the fibers that you're working with. And then you want to add into the smaller side. A lot of people, when they first start out, will have joins. So that's where you have your kind of leftover fibers where you joined it. But as you practice, you'll get past that. So Klahzia is now using corn husks. With the corn husks, you do want to kind of get them into these smaller strips. That's not very hard. Corn husks are pretty easy to strip apart. But the other thing is that you want to soak them. And that's true about anything that you're really making baskets out of or cordage out of. If you've stored it, you have to soak it. And a lot of things are going to be stronger if you've let them dry and then soaked them than they would be whenever you just make them green. So a lot of this basket is made out of green kudzu, right? And we like to use kudzu because it's invasive, because it's not from here. Kudzu has almost no natural predators in Japan and China either. The only reason why it's so abundant and so invasive here is because we are very, very neglectful people. We don't manage it, we don't harvest it. But in China and Japan, people make clothes out of it. They render it into cordage just like this. I think this is the kudzu cordage. They eat it. The new shoots are pretty good. The leaves are pretty good when they're young. The root tubers you can dig up. They're about the size of this table. And then you can pound them out into a flour that you can use to make noodles and breads. And so The kudzu that we used here was green. As you can see, a lot of it is still green. And the reason why people wouldn't want to do that historically is because they're making baskets in very specific shapes, right? You've probably seen basically basket backpacks people have made that are incredibly ergonomic and suited to the shape of their own back. A lot of people would carry their babies around in those historically. Now you imagine carrying a baby around for 10 hours a day in a backpack. You want that thing to suit the curve of your back perfectly, right? If you weave with green fibers that haven't been soaked, it's going to warp over time. And as it dries, it's going to change its shape. Now, with something like this, more like chaotic weave that you're trying to have fun with, that doesn't really matter as much. And so this is where we kind of get into the trade-offs between the amount of labor that you put into something and like what you need it for. So if you just have this for your cat or your kid to sleep in, and it's kind of a fun thing that you expect to get broken at some point, who cares if you leave it green? Who cares if it's like kind of all over the place? That's the point, right? It's a lot easier. But if you are relying on this to carry your food home after you walk 10 miles to your favorite hickory tree, you're not going to leave it green. All right, so this is the corn husks that Klahzia was working with. And you see where I was talking about joins earlier. Each of these is where Klahzia was adding in new corn husks, or where the corn husks that were in there were kind of multi-layered and fell out the sides. You can trim these off, but like I said, if you get really good at it, you don't have to. And people made things like bowstrings like this, right? A bowstring can hold hundreds of pounds of force, right? And you use it day after day after day. I've used homemade bowstrings on 120-year-old bows, and the strings themselves might be 25, 30 years old and still going. Somebody made that. Somebody made that out of plants, right? It is incredibly impressive what we are able to do when we identify things in the world around us. I think a lot of us feel very disconnected from nature and very hopeless a lot of the time. But whenever you realize that everything that you have came from this planet, and everything that you have came from a complicated system of people learning how to use the things that this earth provides, you can really feel a very strong sense of connection as you learn what those things are used for and what your options are. So many different plants can be made into fiber. And the ways to do it are multitudinous. Klahzia, how do you get the fibers out of the yucca efficiently?
Oh, you don't have your spoon anymore? You've been scraping it with a spoon.
So you scrape it with a spoon? See, that's really cool. And I know some people from the Muskogee tribe, they'll take and they'll basically break it over a fence post. Other people do it against their leg. Some people use a knife. Some people beat it with a stone. There's lots of ways to render it out. If you're making baskets out of, say, an ash tree or a white oak tree, you soak a log in water for about 10 years. You basically just dump it in the bottom of the lake. Then you pull it out and you hammer it. And you sit there and you hammer it for days and days and days. And each layer of growth in that tree becomes a little ribbon. Every year that that tree lived becomes a little ribbon of fiber. And that is how most of the baskets that you would buy at the store are made, is that they are pounded out plants, they're pounded out trees, ash, oak, lots of different species, and they've just been woven together. And I think that that's really, really impressive. Now, a lot of how we make baskets and how we make cordage is something that has had to change over time and will continue to have to change. If you tried to do everything the exact same way that indigenous peoples this area did it prior to colonization, you would probably be doing a lot of ecological damage because you would only be harvesting the native plants and you wouldn't be harvesting any of the invasive plants. And similarly, we have all of these non-native pests and blights that were brought over here, like the emerald ash borer, which is wiping out a lot of ash trees along the eastern coast. Well, historically, ash was the preferred plant for baskets, right? Now, black ash, if you harvest it, it actually helps fight off the emerald ash borer because it can come back up, it can be pollarded, and a lot of times that's really helpful. But with the white ash, over-harvesting for the use of baskets is part of the reason why it's disappearing from our landscape alongside the emerald ash borer. But using something like kudzu or mimosa bark to make your baskets instead, that is actually doing the ecology around you a favor. We're all scared of climate change, we're all scared of invasive species taking over, but people have told me that creeping jasmine in my yard, there's no way to get rid of it. Well, I've been using it to repair baskets for a year, and I've removed it from a significant area. People tell me that wisteria, once it's there, it's going to spread and take over everything. Well, there is native wisterias, but the non-native one, that is true if you're not using it. But I've been making baskets, repairing baskets with the wisteria in my yard for a while. It doesn't spread at all. It doesn't take over anything. Same thing with the non-native Japanese honeysuckle, and that can also be rendered into fiber. So it's really about what choices we make and what we choose to do with the plants around us and the world around us. These are issues of management, not issues of doom. Everything that we have done to the climate and everything that we have done to the landscapes around us, we have done to try to make our lives better. We have done to try to make resources. We dig petroleum out of the earth so that we can make plastic fibers. But we know how to make fibers, right? We destroy the landscapes because we want to make, a beautiful garden using invasive plants, right? But we can do it with native plants. There are so many uses of the things around you. It's a different way to live, but it's an important way to live. The reason that I started a basket making club is because I have issues with my hands and I had trouble making baskets, but I needed some baskets because I was eating a lot of hickory nuts. My refrigerator had broke. We were also flat broke. And I was just going out and picking hickory nuts every day in persimmons. That was about a third of what I ate. I made bread. And I just needed more baskets to put my hickory nuts in. And I was like, well, I got this Native Plant Society. Maybe I'll start a basket club and people will give them to me. And it really is just like that. You go to the grocery store now and you spend time on that. You go and you work a job so that you can pay for that food. But you have other options. You can go, you can rely on the landscape to provide for you. You can spend your time differently. The amount of time you spend cooking breakfast could be used cracking open hickory nuts. And there's a lot of different things you can make baskets out of. This is pine needles, southern longleaf pine, one of the staples of our ecosystem. Whenever you're harvesting pine needles for basketry, what you really want to do is you want to get them green. You never want to take them off of the very top of a young plant, it'll kill it. But you want to get them green, then you want to pour boiling water over them, and then let that sit for an hour. What that'll do is it'll extract the resins from the inside of the pine needle, and it'll seal it on the outside. And that's historically how Native people in this area made watertight baskets that were incredibly light out of pine needles. Now, pottery was invented in this area. Pottery was invented, I think, 5 different times across recorded history. But if you think about a pot, that's heavy. Very, very heavy. If you're going to lug water with you as like a person who's probably walking 10, 15 miles in a day sometimes, you really don't want to put that in a pot. So you would either put it in a gourd or you would put it in a pine needle basket. And this is something that you can learn how to do on your own. And right here you see we've used thread to tie these together. But you can also use the sinew from the back of a deer's leg. And if you don't have access to that, you can make your own cordage. You could knit together those pine needles with this, right?
Some people just use one needle from every bunch and wrap that around and tie it.
Oh, that's really cool. Klahzia was saying that some people use a needle from every bunch to wrap it around too, so that you don't even have to have thread. There's so many different tactics of this, and I don't know about y'all, but whenever I was a kid, I really felt like my education was so incomplete and so silly because I had learned all of this math and history and English, which was great. But I was like, but what tree is that? I have no idea, And where does string come from? I mean, these are these basic questions that historically children would have known. We think about like indigenous peoples, historical peoples as being kind of uneducated a lot in our society. But truthfully, how many of you knew a third of what we've talked about so far today? I saw one hand, right? The thing about this is that this is its own form of education. This is its own form of life ways. If you were living like an indigenous person on this landscape, this would matter a lot more to you than, prime numbers. That stuff's important, it really is. But it builds a society where we're really focused on how do we calculate the trajectory of a bomb instead of, how do we calculate the beauty of the weaving that we're going to use to carry food to our family? All right, is there anything else that y'all want to talk about or show off? So if you see Nick here is rendering fibers from yucca, just using a board and a spoon. Now historically, indigenous people in this area would not have had metal spoons until they started trading with settlers. There were some copper spoons further up north because you had deposits of copper that could be hammered. And some of that was traded down here, but it would have been a prized item and copper bends pretty easily. But what they did have, and what you'll probably see if you drive just a couple miles that way, is seashells. And seashells have their own grading effect, basically. And so seashells can render that even better in some ways. And a lot of indigenous people would take and they would strap basically handles to the shells. And you would use the same tool that you use to scrape the yucca to help flesh the hide on a deer. And so a lot of these things, as you become good at one of them, you become good at the rest of them. This coiling pattern that you use whenever you're making your baskets out of pine needles, very similar to a coiling pattern you might use whenever you're making pottery, right? And whenever you're baking the fish that you caught in your pine needle basket trap, you're going to wrap that fish in clay. And then eventually some of that clay is going to set just right, and then you're going to say, that's hard. I made a rock. Maybe I could make a pot out of that. All of this is interconnected. Learning one thing helps you learn something else, right? And that's an important thing to remember. All right, I'm going to be back up here in a little while to talk to you all about native plants for food, foraging, talk to you about sort of some very long-term plans for how we can cultivate different things on the Gulf Coast. But until then, do I have any questions about fiber arts, material crafting, basically the artsy side of the plants? Yes. So you pour boiling water over top of it. You don't want to boil it because the resin will leave the needles. Now, you can boil pine needles and make vitamin C tablets, basically. That's actually where a lot of our vitamin C that you buy at the grocery store comes from. If you boil it for about 3 minutes, the pine needles, you get a chicken broth flavor. If you boil it a lot longer, you get an orange juice flavor. But whenever you're trying to make it into a basket, you're not trying to extract the flavor, you're trying to preserve the resin. And so you take and you boil your water and you lay it out flat on like a baking sheet and you pour that over and you let it sit for an hour. Basically, you're letting it get really hot and all the resin extract, and then as it cools down, that resin will cool on the outside and it'll seal it. And it'll make it really, really strong and a lot more watertight. There are other things like you can do that a second time at the end of making the basket so that you can seal the resin over even more. There's also ways of extracting the resin from the needles or the bark of the pine tree and then adding that for additional water repellency. And then you can also add that resin to your buckskins or your ropes to make them stronger and to basically waterproof them a little bit. Did you have another question?
Yeah. How do you make, I see that you have the bottom of the basket, you might have said this before, well, how do you make the sides?
You just start traveling up. Yeah, or you can make this circle and then start again and build the walls that way.
Water over it every single time?
No. You only really have to do that with the needles once, and that's before you can start. And not everybody does that. Like, it's not required that you pour boiling water over it. It makes it last longer, and if you're good at it, it makes it waterproof. If you're good at it. And it's also because it's a coiled weave. So it's not one pine needle, right? This is a cluster of about 15 needles, right? And so all of those with the resin in between, that's where that water tightness comes from. Were there any other questions? All right. Thank you all so very much, and I'll see you all in a little bit. And if you have any questions, the table with the little green tablecloth is where you can ask about cordage and baskets.